Every era has its champions, and when people talk about the 1970s muscle car wars, the same names always rise to the surface. The engines that won magazine covers, dragstrip glory, and permanent space in history books. If you know muscle cars, you already know those stories by heart, but buried just beneath that familiar noise is something far more uncomfortable. A big block that didn't chase fame, didn't need approval, and somehow managed to terrify the street without becoming a legend. It shouldn't exist in the way it does, and maybe that's exactly why it was forgotten. Because while the 70s are remembered as a time of dominance, bravado, and peak displacement, there was one engine quietly rewriting the rules in real-world encounters, not advertisements. It wasn't celebrated, it wasn't mythologized, and it didn't fit the narrative that history prefers to repeat. Instead, it embarrassed cars that were supposed to be untouchable, then slipped into obscurity as if it had never mattered at all. That contradiction is the key, because something powerful enough to unsettle an era somehow faded, leaving behind a question most enthusiasts never think to ask. In the early to mid-1970s, muscle cars weren't just transportation, they were identity. Showrooms were battlefields, magazine covers were scoreboards, and horsepower numbers carried real social weight. Everyone knew which engines ruled the streets. Big blocks weren't optional, they were expected, and anything smaller was treated like a compromise. Names like the 454, the 440, and the 426 weren't just specs, they were reputations built on fear, noise, and authority. This was the peak of the displacement arms race, the last moment before regulations, fuel crises, and insurance companies began tightening the noose. Manufacturers pushed right up to the edge, advertising dominance as loudly as possible. If an engine didn't have a reputation, it didn't matter. If it wasn't in magazines, it didn't exist. The public believed the hierarchy was settled, and most of the time, they were right. Street encounters followed the same script. Certain cars were assumed winners before the light even changed. You didn't question them, you respected them. And if you lined up next to one, you already knew the outcome, or so everyone thought. That confidence is what made the era intoxicating, but also dangerously blind. Because when a landscape becomes predictable, that's exactly when something unexpected can slip through unnoticed. And in a world obsessed with loud victories and recognizable badges, the most unsettling threat wasn't the one shouting for attention. It was the one operating quietly, right under the assumptions everyone stopped questioning. That silence created space for disbelief, for hesitation, and for stories that sounded exaggerated until they weren't. It was the perfect environment for a reputation to spread without marketing, driven by surprise, confusion, and a growing sense that the rules everyone trusted were no longer as solid as they seemed on the street at night when it mattered most. That's where this engine enters the picture, almost accidentally. It wasn't born from a marketing meeting or a desire to dominate magazine headlines. It came from engineers solving a different problem entirely, building a big block for durability, torque, and control, rather than bragging rights. The people behind it weren't chasing mythology, they were chasing results. And the result just happened to be something far more intimidating than anyone expected. This engine was developed quietly, often overshadowed by flashier siblings wearing louder badges and bigger reputations. It shared displacement numbers with famous rivals, but its internal priorities were different. Thick castings, conservative tuning, and an emphasis on low-end force gave it a personality that didn't translate well to brochures. On paper, it looked ordinary. On the street, it was anything but. It wasn't designed to be a hero. It was designed to work, to pull hard and survive abuse without drama. That philosophy meant it didn't need high-strung behavior to make power. Instead, it delivered torque early, smoothly, and relentlessly, the kind that erased hesitation,
and punished overconfidence. Drivers didn't rev it for attention. They leaned into it and felt the outcome immediately.
Because it arrived without fanfare, it never got crowned. There were no slogans built around it, no racing programs dedicated to turning it into a legend. Yet, in real encounters, it rewrote expectations. Cars that assumed victory found themselves scrambling, and explanations came later, often awkward and defensive. This wasn't built to win marketing wars, and that's precisely why it became dangerous. It existed outside the story everyone agreed on, forcing people to question what they thought they knew. And once that doubt crept in, the reputation grew quietly, passed between drivers who had experienced it firsthand, and realized something unsettling had slipped into the era unnoticed. It didn't shout for recognition, and that silence made it easier to dismiss, until the pattern became impossible to ignore, and the whispers grew louder than any advertisement ever could. That was when fear quietly replaced confidence on the streets. What made this engine genuinely terrifying wasn't a single headline number. It was how everything came together once the car was actually moving. On paper, its horsepower figures rarely topped the charts, especially when stacked against the era's loudest big blocks. But torque told a different story, and it arrived early, thick, and relentless. Peak numbers mattered less when the engine was already pulling hard before rivals had even found their stride. Imagine lining it up next to a supposedly untouchable street king. At the hit, there was no dramatic flair, no high RPM scream, just an immediate surge that shoved the car forward with unsettling certainty. While other engines built speed theatrically, this one erased distance. Period tests showed mid-range acceleration that embarrassed cars with better press and bigger reputations, especially in real-world roles where traction and usable power mattered more than brochure glory. The torque curve was the secret weapon. Broad, flat and forgiving, it made the engine brutally effective in situations drivers actually faced. Miss a shift, roll into the throttle a little early, or carry an extra passenger, and it didn't care. That consistency made it dangerous because it punished assumptions. Drivers expecting a slow pull were suddenly staring at tail lights they never thought they'd see. Against contemporary muscle cars, the results were confusing. Wins didn't always align with brand hierarchy, and excuses followed quickly. People blamed gearing, weight, driver error, anything except the truth. The truth was simpler and more uncomfortable. This engine didn't need ideal conditions to perform. It thrived in imperfect ones. That's what made it scary. Not that it was unbeatable, but that it was dependable. It exposed how fragile reputations really were once theory met asphalt. And for those who understood what they were seeing, the realization carried weight. Knowing why it worked meant knowing when it would strike, and that knowledge separated spectators from insiders, the confident from the cautious. It changed how nights ended and conversations started. Afterward, people spoke softer, recalculated matchups, and looked twice at badges they once dismissed. Fear didn't come from losing once, but from realizing it could happen again, consistently, without warning, whenever assumptions replaced understanding on roads where pride usually decided everything. That quiet certainty rewrote street logic permanently for those paying attention. Reputation didn't come from advertisements or showroom bragging. It came from nights when expectations collapsed. This engine lived in cars people dismissed at a glance, badges that didn't trigger caution, silhouettes that blended into traffic. That was the sleeper effect, and it worked because confidence is loud while doubt is quiet. Drivers lined up relaxed, certain they understood the outcome, until the moment torque erased that certainty. Word spread the old way, through stories told with hesitation. Someone lost to a car they were supposed to beat. Someone else watched it happen. Explanations followed, but none felt satisfying. You could hear it in the tone when people mentioned it. A mix of disbelief and reluctant respect. The engine didn't need to win every time. It only needed to win often enough to make people nervous. What made it worse was how ordinary it looked, No dramatic idle, no wild revving, no visual warning signs. That absence of theatre disarmed opponents. By the time they realized something was wrong, it was already happening. Pride took the hit first, then confidence. Losing to a legend is acceptable. Losing to something you underestimated stays with you. That's how fear becomes memory. Each encounter added another layer, another quiet confirmation that assumptions were dangerous. People started avoiding certain matchups, choosing excuses over rematches. Those who knew, knew, and that knowledge became a kind of currency. Being aware meant being prepared. Being unaware meant learning the hard way. The engine's reputation never needed volume. It thrived in scarcity, in half-heard warnings and unfinished sentences. And for those who experienced it firsthand, the lesson stuck longer than any spec sheet ever could, because it wasn't learned in theory. It didn't disappear because it failed. In many ways, it vanished because it arrived at exactly the wrong moment. By the mid-70s, the rules were changing faster than reputations could adapt. Emissions regulations tightened, fuel prices climbed, and insurance companies began treating performance like a liability instead of a selling point. Power wasn't just expensive anymore, it was suspicious. Engines that thrived on simplicity and torque suddenly existed in a world that no longer rewarded either. Manufacturers responded by retreating, not innovating. Marketing departments shifted focus, choosing safer narratives over raw capability. This engine suffered quietly inside its own company, overshadowed by better-known platforms and internal politics that favored familiarity over effectiveness. It wasn't that it couldn't evolve, it was that no one was willing to fight for it when survival meant compromise. Timing compounded the problem. Muscle culture itself was changing. The street stopped being the proving ground, and regulation became the referee. An engine designed for real-world strength didn't translate cleanly into detuned brochures and shrinking horsepower numbers. What once made it formidable now made it inconvenient. There's irony in that. The very traits that terrified competitors became the reasons it was sidelined. Broad torque, durability, and understated performance don't photograph well, and they don't survive eras obsessed with optics. As newer engines arrived, with cleaner images and louder stories, this one was quietly phased out, remembered less for what it did than for what it didn't advertise. History tends to reward winners who fit the narrative. This engine didn't. It wasn't defeated on the street, it was suffocated by circumstance. And because it left without spectacle, its absence went largely unnoticed, leaving behind only fragments of reputation and the uncomfortable truth that some of the most effective machines are the easiest to erase when the world decides it's time to move on. That silence is why it feels like a loss today. Not because it was perfect, but because history moved forward without acknowledging what it quietly proved. Power doesn't always announce itself, and things that scare people most are the easiest to forget. What makes this engine's legacy so strange is that it never truly ended. It just stopped being named. Its influence carried forward quietly, embedded in design choices that favored usable torque over dramatic peak numbers. Engineers remembered what worked, even when marketing forgot why. You can trace its philosophy in later engines that prioritized mid-range strength, drivability, and durability, especially when performance shifted from raw bravado to controlled force. It showed that power doesn't need to arrive violently to be effective. That idea resurfaced decades later as manufacturers chased real-world acceleration instead of paper dominance. Broad torque curves, restrained tuning, and engines built to perform without constant attention all echo the same lesson this big block taught first. It mattered more than people realize because it reshaped how performance could feel, not just how it could be measured. Even modern performance trends reflect that mindset. Today's fastest vehicles rely on accessible power, not just headline horsepower. They're engineered to deliver confidence, not chaos. That through line didn't appear overnight. It was learned, tested, and proven long before technology caught up to the concept. The engine's name faded, but its impact didn't. It became part of the foundation rather than the monument. And for those who recognize it, that quiet continuity offers a deeper satisfaction than any badge ever could. Because understanding where ideas come from changes how you see everything that followed. History usually celebrates what was loudest, fastest, and easiest to sell. But sometimes the most important threats don't fit neatly into those stories. This engine didn't need legend status to matter. It didn't need trophies or slogans to leave a mark. It simply did its job too well to be ignored by those who encountered it, even if history later chose to look away. Remembering it now isn't about nostalgia alone. It's about recognizing that dominance isn't always visible, and fear doesn't always announce itself. Some machines earn respect not through spectacle, but through consistency, surprise, and the way they challenge assumptions. That's why this big block still feels unsettling in retrospect. It reminds us that the narrative we inherit is often incomplete. Now you know there was something else out there. Something operating just outside the spotlight, rewriting expectations one encounter at a time. That knowledge changes how the era looks, and maybe how you look at legends in general. Because sometimes the real story isn't about who won the loudest wars, but about who quietly made everyone else nervous enough to remember, even decades later, what it felt like to be wrong.